Hi, in this lecture I'm going to briefly talk about type 1 and type 2 error. So whenever we try to estimate about the population parameter based on some study in sample, we tend to make some kinds of error, although majority of the time we should be able to make an correct decision. But these are some type of error that could happen and some errors that we could anticipate. Right? So let's just look at the orientation of this table first to explain these concepts. So this is something that you study based on a sample. So let's say you are studying everyone in this particular class, CHLs 244, some 37 students or something, to calculate the mean BMI for entire United States population as an example. So this is something about the population. So that is the truth about the population or the reality. But you simply cannot study everyone in the population. So you study instead a sample from the population. And based on that sample, you decide the mean. How would that reflect for even entire United States population or any population? So these are the two things that we are going to look at in rows and columns. So in rows, when you study sample, you are going to either reject the null hypothesis or fail to reject the null hypothesis. So these are the only two possible. Before that, I'll just briefly explain what do we mean by null hypothesis. So an alternative hypothesis. So this is the null hypothesis represented as H sub O. So we basically say the mean remains same as 0, or if you already have some theoretical background, then we say maybe mean represents something like 20, you know. And then someone might say, based on my sample or based on my judgment, intellectual um, property, some findings from small sample pilot, you can say that actually the mean should be something like less than 20. So that could be your one-sided alternative here, and it could be different things, but just for example, this is something what we mean by null and alternative hypothesis. And we also know that null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis are two mutually exclusive events. So only one can occur, only one can be true. So if this occurs, that means this does not occur or less likely going to occur. So with that little bit of background, now let's see if we study the sample and we could either reject the null hypothesis. That means we are rejecting the null. So in other words, we favor alternative hypothesis. So you can also write it as that means we alternative is true. So that's first row. The other would be we fail to reject null. That means there is a possibility that we will anticipate to have null hypothesis correct. So basically this is true, or we don't say exactly this is true, but we fail to reject null. That means it's possible that this is going to be true. And similar things, similar two possibilities could occur for population as well. So population, you can also get null as true or alternative as true. So if we say we reject the null, that means the alternative is true from our sample, and based on the reality or truth from the population, we also get alternative as true. So these two things are same. That means we made a correct decision right here. Okay. So similarly, if you fail to reject null from your sample or based on your sample, so you fail to reject, that means you anticipate that null is more likely to be true. So from the reality, truth about the population, you also say that null is true. Again, that means you made a correct decision. So these are the times that you make correct decisions. Now let's look at the error. So if you find something and that's not true with what is there in population, then we call that as an error, right? And we can see that it can occur twice or in two different occasions. So when we say we reject the null, in other words, alternative is true from our sample, but in reality, truth about population is null is true. So we kind of rejected it, but actually that is true. So we made that error, right? And that is called as type 1 error or alpha. And we know that these are all probabilities. So this is also an alpha or the significance level that we compare. The another possibility is when based on sample, we fail to reject null. That means we anticipate null is true, but in reality, the alternative is true. Right? So again, these two decisions doesn't match. So we know that we made some kind of error, and that is the type 2 error, or in other words, we call it as beta. So type 1 error, now let's go over this definition. Type 1 error occurs when we reject the null, hypothesis, but null hypothesis is actually true. That means reality is true. So actually null is true. That's nothing but type 1 error. Type 2 error says it occurs when we fail to reject null, but the null hypothesis is actually false. So actually null hypothesis is false. That means alternative is true, right? And that's nothing but type 2 error. And we can also look at this particular correct decision, this particular cell as power a little bit later, and power is also nothing but 1 minus beta. This formula can be useful if you want to calculate one or the other. So just make sure you know that too.